there's been an increase anyways in the amount of people contacting me in regards to uh, finding themselves in a situation where they be maybe nearing homelessness, or in tough situations where people are struggling to make ends meet, and to pay their rent. And we're talking about families and stuff who may have two people with two full-time jobs, and they're still struggling on that end. So it is disappointing to see that there's not much change in the figures, and we're kind of continuing in crisis mode. And it's hard because there's not a lot of supports either for families, and you can't help but sometimes feel a little bit helpless as well, because the book ultimately stops here with the government and with Fianna
Mm.
Fáil and Fine Gael.
Indeed. And capacity, a major issue there as well. There just aren't the spaces for the amount of people that are looking for accommodation.
Yeah, I mean that's it. I mean, number one, you have the private rental market um is a catastrophe right now for anyone trying to privately rent. And then if you were to, let's say, be on HAP at the moment, it is very, very difficult in County Clare to get a HAP property. It is extremely difficult. So even if you go through that process with the council and you are granted HAP, there is no guarantee that you can get accommodation. And then on the other side, then is that if you end up homeless and you are in need of emergency accommodation, I mean, I know people who right now in County Clare are sleeping in their car, and we're talking about people 60, 50, 40 years of age. We're talking about people who have families. We're talking about people who have worked all their lives. And it's just heartbreaking to see that, this is become normalized somewhat because we're so used to seeing the figures. And I think we really have to kind of look beyond the figures for a moment and think that, these are our neighbors. These can be, people's family members, people's mothers, fathers,
Mm.
and really humanize this, because we can sometimes get lost in the figures. And we really have to make sure that this does not become um what's accepted and what's normal.
Yeah, and we've heard a lot in recent years about the changing face of homelessness, the changing demographic of people who fall into homelessness. The stereotype, perhaps, the traditional image we would have had of a homeless person doesn't apply anymore. And I think that's what you're saying there, that we're seeing families, we're seeing couples, we're seeing people with children, people who are, as you say, have a full-time job, their partner has a full-time job. They're at risk of falling into emergency accommodation or worse.
Yeah, and see, that's the thing, and it's completely changed, like you mentioned there. And it's become the norm that you know people are struggling. And I think it's absolutely disgraceful that that somehow become normalized in Ireland today. So yeah, and I suppose as well the fact that you have people who are doing everything right. I suppose if you put it like that, and checking all the boxes, but still are facing homelessness, or are still struggling to make ends meet. And like I said, there's people right now in County Clare who have full-time jobs, who are going to work, who are doing everything right, and they are sleeping in their cars. And that is just an utter failure, and it is absolutely heartbreaking to think that this is happening in 2026 in Ireland.
Shane, if there was one measure that the government could bring in within the next month to, at the very least, slow this increase of people falling into homelessness, what would that be?
Well, they need to put a ban on no-fault evictions for 3 years, and they need to invest heavily into emergency accommodation right now because we're at a crisis point. They need to invest heavily with the NGOs that are operating on the ground and working on the ground with the families, with the people who are facing homelessness. And they need to stop slashing the money into schemes like tenant in situ. And they need to fund our councils properly to make sure that they can look after people in those areas.